Good morning to Adam. Good afternoon to the others. Welcome to this session on navigating a more polarized world, policy implication. I'm Jean Pisani. I'm a senior fellow with Bruegel, and I will be moderating this session with, in the order of initial remarks, Adam Tooze, Hélène Rey, and Sabine Veillant. Let me first say a few words on the topic. The topic, if you want to put it simply, is should we have another look at globalization? You know, the sort of very simple view of globalization is that, as Tom Friedman said, that the world had become flat, and therefore that it was for everyone a sort of economically dominated, full of opportunity system for development, for growth, for prosperity. The reasons why we want to re-examine this view, this always too simple view, is twofold. First, there is evidence with, let's summarize, with networks, with the rise of networks, there is evidence of growing polarization. So something that's structured in perhaps a different way than the way we thought the economy was structured in a simple model. Polarization implies asymmetries, implies different degrees of influence, of power, and that's the first reason why we may wish to look back at the way we organize our thoughts on globalization. The second reason is more geopolitical, is this emergence of rivalry, especially between China and the US, but also the fact that, to use an expression that was coined by Henry Farrell and Adam Newman, the weaponization of international relations. And the fact that foreign policy experts look at globalization, look at international economic relations in a different way from the way we economists look at them. Especially with the Biden administration, there is a view explicitly expressed by Jake Sullivan, for example, the National Security Council, that too much was left in the management of globalization to economists, and that foreign policy has to take back control of globalization. So that's what we want to discuss and to draw policy implications. For this discussion, we're lucky to have three absolutely perfect speakers. The first is Adam Tooze. So Adam Tooze, who is a professor of history at Columbia, he's a prolific writer, he's a prolific speaker, he's a prolific tweeter. If you haven't read his book, his last book crashed. If you haven't read the other books, you shouldn't wait until your next holidays to read them, although they are long. And perhaps you'll tell us what's the topic of the book you're working on at present. So we start with Adam, with a sort of more perspective of history. Then we'll continue with Hélène Rey. Hélène is a professor at the London Business School, and she's perhaps the one that contributed the most to changing our views on the way the global financial system is structured. In a series of papers, she's looked at the enduring influence of the US financial system on the global economy, quite differently from what the most simple model would suggest. The importance of capital flows, the way capital flows are driven by US monetary policy. And, to put it simply, one of the reasons why, when we're looking at Europe and the US, it's always, how what's happening in the US is going to determine what's going to happen in Europe, and not so much vice versa. So Hélène will continue, and lastly, we'll have Sabine Veillant, the Director General for Trade. So Sabine got quite a lot of fame for being the deputy to Michel Barnier and the Iron Lady in the Brexit negotiation. Perhaps not enough fame, actually, compared to what she did. Now she's a Director General for Trade, and she will tell us from where she sits, from her perspective, what are the potential implications of this, especially the interference between geopolitics and economics, but more broadly, the change in perspective. So we start with Adam for 8 minutes, and we'll continue with all speakers for 8 minutes each, and then we'll have a round of discussion, and we'll open to questions from Sidelow. As usual, you should ask your questions through Sidelow, sidelow.com, sidelow.com. Adam.
Thank you so much, Jean. It's an absolute delight to be here on this formidable panel, and to pick up where you left off. I think amongst the factors that are further, I think, putting in question the model of globalization, other than polarization and weaponization, I think the third factor we might want to consider, and is absolutely crucial with regard to the American case, which I'm going to focus my remarks on, is a kind of an internal unsettlement of globalization, right? The entire question of inequality, polarization domestically, and the undermining thereby of the domestic foundations of globalization. Because I think if we're asking the question that we're asking in this panel here, we're asking it in part, not exclusively, but in very large part because of the unsettlement of the prevailing policy regime, indeed even the constitutional framework in the United States. And the United States is not just one actor in the system, but it remains in many crucial metrics the dominant actor. It is also historically the key driver, as Paul Krugman observed in an excellent column a few days ago. It is not by any means the only driver of hyperglobalization, but I don't think there's any doubt that without the framework provided by the United States, really continuously since the late 1960s and with real urgency since the 1990s, globalization in the form that we know it would not have come into existence. And it is the questioning of that model within the United States, which more than anything else, I would submit, contributes to our current questioning. This isn't to say that the rise of China is not a crucial issue. It's just that the rise of China per se would not, I think, fundamentally challenge the model at its current level, but the American reaction to China's rise does. I want to focus my remarks on three different dimensions of policy about which our other co-panelists have far more to say than me, but it may help frame things. And I think if we're talking about an unsettling, questioning of globalization at its current moment, these are the three that we need to focus on. What I mean is trade, finance, and tech, defense. And in a sense, the three stories I'd like to tell differ, and I know Helena is going to push perhaps in a similar direction, that we need to take a differentiated view of this problem. As we all know, trade was the dimension that was most directly and immediately politicized in the United States, beginning with the 2016 election, in which the American Chamber of Commerce couldn't find a candidate to back. That's the lobby of American business, because none of the serious candidates for the American presidency were any longer committed to a free trade agenda. It's an open secret, I think, that if Clinton had won the presidency, TPP would still have been abandoned. Trump did it in a gratuitous and aggressive way, but there is no prospect really that the Democratic administration would have pushed further on this. And we all know the degree of unsettlement which had begun to ripple through the global trading system by 2018, 2019. It shows up. The causality may be complex here, and I'm no econometrician, and I'm sure econometricians will want to dig into this, but it appeared to be showing up in the trade patterns of several of the key players in the global system in 2018, 2019. The uncertainty spawned by the shift in policy towards an aggressive, in fact, crude kind of protectionism on the American side. I think the surprise, in some sense, is that by the summer of 2020, the trade negotiators were the one part of the global system that were in fact still talking to each other. I mean, if you had said in 2016 that Robert Lighthizer would be the rational, reasonable, sustaining core of Washington's relationship with Beijing, people would have laughed at you, but that was undoubtedly true by the summer of 2020. because that was at least recognizable policy. It was crude, it was quota-based. Phase one was a brutally simple trade deal, but it was at least a deal, and it was negotiations aiming at a deal. Right now, it seems to me what's really very striking about Washington's position, and again, this isn't to say this is the whole story, but Washington's position and posture is crucial to the overall atmosphere of global trade policy, is how little the Biden administration wants to say about it. And I think the single most important, crucial takeaway for the rest of the world thinking about this is just how disabled the United States is on trade policy right now. And this ripples through to every other dimension of their strategic interaction with the world. The prospect of trying to push a big package deal on trade through American Congress is just toxic for all political sides. So, as it were, there, a kind of a paralysis, if you like, driven overwhelmingly by that third factor, which we have to reckon with, which is domestic unsettlement. The second issue is finance, and Helene is, of course, the world expert on this, and we've all learned enormously from her work. But I have to say that I was surprised by what happened in 2020. All of us can probably remember anxious conversations amongst people interested in these kind of things, like swap lines and global liquidity, about whether or not a Trump White House and a Republican Congress would greenlight the kind of stabilization of the global dollar system, which we basically, I think, believed was crucial to avoiding the worst after 2008. And there were a lot of anxious conversations about whether the Fed would be able to do the kind of global liquidity provision which it had done before. And what's really, I think, remarkable is how that is the dog that didn't bark. When push came to shove, the profound integration of the American financial system, including, it appears, the US Treasury market, with the global system, meant that, selfish or not, altruistic or not, nationalist or not, the Americans acted. And they acted on an even huger scale than they did in 2008. Now, there may be some tactical political stuff here, and if the Republicans had not had their man in the White House, it's possible that Ted Cruz and so on would have caused more of a fuss. But nevertheless, with a Republican in the Fed, with a Republican president and a powerful Republican voice in Congress, the United States continued to fulfill that role. So as much as we see tension and polarization, there seems to be an incredibly powerful functional imperative there for the Triffin problem to solve itself by means of further liquidity provision. Huge proviso to this. This does not go for the more fragile and complex institutions of multilateral finance. So IMF governance is a much, much more sensitive issue in these terms. And we saw that with the veto on SDR issuance in 2020, counter to the European African proposal. And we see that in the limited quantity of SDRs that are on the table right now, capped at what you can get through without congressional approval. So here again, a kind of rate limiting factor from the American side. But the really crucial point, which is the one that John came round to at the end of his talk, is the one I think we simply have not fully assimilated yet. And it is indeed incredibly difficult for folks focused on the economic policy side of globalization to assimilate, which is that the mood on the crucial axis of globalization since the 1990s has fundamentally shifted in Washington, such that the basic trading relationship between the United States and China is viewed now by the most powerful voices in policy making as fundamentally a geopolitical and strategic one, in which issues of national security defined explicitly in hard power terms are the trump card. It's not simply that Jake Sullivan claims that foreign policy ought to matter more. It's quite evident that the national security establishment in the United States is calling the shots on the China-US relationship in general. And there is no area where this is more evident than in the area of tech sanctions and tech regulations. Now, these are an important part of global trade, but they are not captured, and the significance of this is not captured in quantitative measures of a macroeconomic variety. And that is, in a sense, also the fundamental aim of the Pentagon. It's really quite mind-bending when you appreciate what they're trying to do. They fully understand, as American strategists have all the way back to Walt Rostow, that the basic dynamic of globalization, when it succeeds, is centrifugal and multipolar. And the aim, however, if you're in the business of maintaining America's massive unipolar dominance as a military hyperpower is to push back against that and resist it. And it is on the front line of tech that this tension has fundamentally developed. The Pentagon's aim is to maintain American supremacy despite that centrifugal force. And the crucial thing is that these aren't niche boutique technologies like nuclear power in a sense was. In this new age, it involves them regulating the key ingredients of the cutting edge, the bleeding edge of the entire service industrial data tech-driven economy. The fact that Huawei is issuing new phones this season that are 4G is an indication of the force of this and its implications for major corporate actors in the system. And that, I think, is the dynamic we really have to reckon with. Just think of the position of Hank Paulson as Treasury Secretary in the 2000s, chosen by Bush because he is Goldman Sachs' China hand, and the position now with regard to Janet Yellen and her relative priority in American decision-making with regard to China. The Treasury is doing the sorts of things it is because it can't do policy on China, right? The remit has shifted to other people in Washington who now set the terms for that. It's hugely political. It's one thing Congress can agree on, practically the only thing. And it is, as it were, that moving the line between hard power and economics. I have spoken for too long already. I'll wrap it up there. I look forward very much to hearing from the other panelists.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. What you said reminded me of something that the Director General of the WTO said this morning. When she said trade is looked at as an instrument, not as an end, but as an instrument that meant to serve other priorities. Hélène, the floor is yours. Can you continue?
Thank you very much, Jean, and thank you very much, Adam, for this great first intervention. So I'm going to first define what I think an international economist would mean by a multipolar world, and what it means for the European Union in particular to be in that type of world. I think we are used to think about really a world with a hegemon following post-World War II, a hegemon which is the United States, of course, with multilateral rules which have been set out in particular in the Bretton Woods institutions, so trade within the GATT, WTO, international finance with the IMF, and as Adam pointed out, the very important role of liquidity provision by the Federal Reserve, so swap lines which are provided during crisis time, which are very important liquidity lines for the rest of the world. And in that world, the US has definitely been the dominant player in trade, not so anymore, as I will show you, and is still extremely dominant in international finance and in liquidity provision. And from that point of view, I think the analysis of Charlie Kindleberger on the role of a hegemon is very important for us to understand the way the macroeconomy has functioned in the world economy. So according to Charlie Kindleberger, the role of a center country, so in our case, at least until recently, the US is the one of an importer of last resort. And why is that important? Because that means that when economic activity goes down in global crisis times, when transactions and trade go down, when there are important frictions in the world economy, the center country, because it can still finance itself, because it can issue a lot of liquidity, and this is the famous international role of the dollar, the famous exorbitant privilege and all that, because of all these features, the center country can effectively keep the world economy going. And in the case, of course, when the hegemon is providing macroeconomic policies which are expansionary enough. So this hegemonic structure, I think, is very, very important for the stabilization of the world economy, and effectively has been providing some kind of backbone for the world economy post Second World War. But this structure, I think recently we can see that it is being put in question. And here maybe we have a small difference with Adam, because I think it comes from the relative growth of the different economic areas in the world. So of course, very quick growth in Asia, and in particular in China, relative decline of the US and the European economy. And because of this differential in growth and in growth prospects, we have seen, I think, and we are seeing the emergence of a multipolar world, but at very different speeds, depending whether we look at international trade links or whether we look at international financial link. And here, if I may, I just want to show you very quickly, in fact, 2 slides only here. I hope you can see them.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. So, all right. So I'm going to try again. Can you see them now? Not yet. Okay. Sorry.
Yes.
You can see?
Yeah. No, we see Adam, but we.
You cannot. Okay.
Can you show the slides instead of? Yes.
Can you see now?
That's good.
Okay. So what I want to show you here is the first network, which is a trade network computed using value added. And the size of the node is proportional to the size of bilateral exports and imports from certain countries. So you see that we have very big nodes, which are the big trade countries. And if we stare at this world network of trade, we see that the US and China are the very big key players here in these trade networks. And then there is a collection of smaller players, which aggregated would be an important also third player, which is Europe. Yeah, and so we see very much a tripolar world here in terms of trade.
We can't see the countries on the graph, but we can see the image, and the image I think is telling in this regard.
Okay, so you can see
the big circle is what? It's China, right?
The big circle is the US, and the second biggest circle is China, and then we have a pretty collection of relatively big circles in gray, which are the European economies. Okay, so this is really the structure of international trade network. And now I'm going to show you another network, which you will see, I guess you will see mostly again the image, but which will look quite different. And this is the financial network. And here there is one big circle only, which dominates, and this is the US. Okay, and this is the financial network. This is the network based on external assets and liabilities of countries. And there, the US is clearly dominant. Then we have a number of European countries, and China is, I would say, nowhere to be seen, okay, on that network. So this is what I wanted to emphasize here, is that we have a very asymmetric emergence of multipolarity in the world economy, depending on whether we look at financial links, in which the US is still very much dominant, Europe is somewhere, and China is really nowhere to be seen yet, and trade, in which we do see already kind of 3 big players, the US, China, which is very large player, and Europe. So in that world, I think the kind of classic hegemonic structure doesn't apply any longer. We are seeing a world in which the multilateral governance of the Bretton Woods institution is effectively being eroded. And we have seen recently the temptation to abuse power in terms of some of, in the US, the role of Donald Trump here has been pretty explicit in terms of weaponization of the dollar, for example. And the weaponization of the role of a hegemon in foreign policy. So this is something that Adam alluded to. And in that case, what can the European Union do in a world in which we have this new multipolarity and in which clearly Europe is kind of, I wouldn't say in the middle ground, but is a very important player in trade, not so important, at least yet, in international finance, and where China is clearly making headways in trade and is going to be making probably headways in international finance with the internationalization of the RMB, etc., in the future, in the medium term. Well, so on the European side, I think it's pretty clear that the absence of a common army or foreign policy has meant that the EU has been a relatively weak actor. But in terms of trade, of course, in terms of regulation, the EU has been an important actor, which shows that when the EU speaks with one voice, it's much more powerful than, of course, individual countries. But this power has come from one important fact, which is the size of the market, of the EU single market. The EU has been powerful to some extent, simply because the single market is an important market, and bargaining power is proportional to economic size. And if we think about it that way, that clearly means that time is working against the EU, as the weight of the EU in the world economy is going down in relative term. So if this is the case, then I think what the EU has to work on is to put in place, to work on new tools and institutions to restore some multilateral thinking in order to achieve or to allow European values to survive in this much more polarized world economy that we are seeing. And there are lots of different domains in which we can think about what the EU could do. But I think one particularly important area right now has to do, of course, with climate policy and how the EU can drive forward climate policy not only within its border, but of course, what is very important is uniformity of climate policy, is extending climate policy in other blocks, because the EU is responsible for a very small fraction of carbon emissions worldwide. And in order to do so, I think the initiative of carbon border adjustment mechanism is something that the EU has to pursue and discuss in a multilateral forum like the WTO. And there are other things that, of course, the EU has been working on, but that should be pushed forward, which have to do with data privacy law in particular, and an international regulatory standard on these issues. So I could expand on all this, but I think these are two examples where I think it's quite critical for the EU to take a stand and to pursue discussions in multilateral forum in order for, in a way, the European values to be taken up in this new polarized and maybe more antagonistic environment. So let me stop here, and maybe we can develop some of these issues later.
Thank you. Before I give the floor to Sabine, first, if you could ask your question on Slido. There are no questions yet for those in the public. Second, I'd like sort of to go back to things you said. First, there was a nuance between what Adam said and what you said on what you call the weaponization of the dollar. Because Adam said precisely that this, provision of liquidity, extension of swap lines, was the field where there was no weaponization and where the Trump administration did basically the same and even more than what the Bush and Obama administration did at the time of the global financial crisis. So there's perhaps a nuance there. Second, are you saying, Hélène, that by itself, the coexistence of a very balanced system of trade, where you have at least multiple poles and a single unipolar financial system, is a tension that by itself creates a difficulty, or are you just showing that we have different structures? And perhaps Adam can also intervene, and then I give the floor to Sabine.
Yeah, so on the second point, so I think what I'm saying is that a system in which, I do not think a system in which there is emergence of very important poles in trade and where the relative economic size of countries is changing massively, is stable with one very dominant financial system player. So I think the relative change on the trade sides, on the real economy side, is also going to be translating itself into relative changes in financial markets, in the importance of different currencies in the medium to long run. So I think we are going to see a more polarized world as well in international finance. And this has a lot of implication potentially for financial stability, liquidity provision, portfolio shifts, etc., which I think we understand not so well, but in my view are potentially quite important. So that's what I was trying to convey with my two-speed polarization, and I don't think we are necessarily in a stable equilibrium right now with this differential between the two systems. And the weaponization of the dollar, I was thinking more about extra jurisdiction, sanctions and stuff like that, using the fact that the dollar is used as an international currency and that essentially no one can afford to be excluded from the US market, which gives you a lot of pressure on a number of players, and that can be used for foreign policy in particular. I was alluding to that, not about the liquidity provision, which indeed happened again this time around and was very welcome.
Thank you. Adam, a quick reaction?
If I may, Jan, yeah. No, I mean, I obviously one needs to distinguish, and it is a fundamental distinction between a strategic use of the dollar as a weapon and crisis responses. My remarks were about crisis responses. The weaponization so far has been targeted, after all, at bit players in the global system, the Venezuelas, the Irans of this world. The real test would come, I think, if a crisis were to develop, for instance, in the financial system of either mainland China or Hong Kong. And I think that's when we would actually see this becoming a real trade-off for American policy. Hong Kong has always been my personal bet, and there were people who, in the United States, hawks, who were speculating about pressure on Hong Kong's financial system last year. That is where the entanglement of the Western and the Chinese financial system is currently still at its most deep, and one of the threads runs from there to the City of London. In fact, the Bank of England has done rather interesting mapping research on this. But it's not until we see a nexus like that emerging that we really would see the tension between those two imperatives. The reason, and so I think that's the crucial thing to focus on. And the other thing to focus on with regard to liquidity provision is that it is first and foremost and centrally driven by the reverberation into America's own financial markets of whatever tension is developing outside. So this is really the shocking discovery of 2020, is that kind of tension within the dollar system is large enough to upset even the single most important asset market in the world, notionally the secure asset market of the world, which is the US Treasury market. And the scale of the Fed's interventions are a measure, I think, of the scale of the terror that was afflicting the New York Fed and Washington in March. I mean, $70 billion a day in asset purchases at its peak at the end of March. They bought 5% of the US Treasury market in a matter of weeks. That's not something we've ever seen before, but it is directly the result of a backflow to the US of tension in the wider world as a result of the March shock. Okay,
thank you. So, Sabine, after this sort of broad view of the different dimensions of what's happening, what is first your reaction on the analysis and then on the policy implications?
Thank you very much. Very interesting, and I will not have the time to react to all the things that the interventions by Adam and Hélène have triggered in me. But in terms of the starting point, I think what we see is a tectonic shift in the global order. And we've talked about the rise of China as a political and economic power, and the fact that the US has retired as a benign hegemon and seems to have lost the appetite for the rules-based system that it was instrumental in bringing about and which it was at the center of for decades. And I think the crucial shift from where I sit is that we are moving from a rules-based system to a power-based system. I think that is also what Adam was referring to when you see that you have the foreign policy establishment asserting itself in the analysis and in the running of global economic policy. And I would say there is a risk in that. The foreign policy establishment will say that trade and economics is too important to be left to economists. That might be true, but I would also say that globalization and economics is too serious to be left to foreign policy types. And why is that? Because there is a fundamental difference in the way in which, from an economic angle, you look at globalization or from a political angle. If you apply a foreign policy power-based analysis, you end up in a zero-sum game. Because the gain of power of one actor is the loss of power of another actor. Whereas in economics, and that is how trade has worked out over the last decades, including in the United States, even if that is not necessarily politically seen at the moment, it's a positive sum game. So we gain together. We then have the problem that Adam rightly referred to, and which is more prominent now, and that is the efficiency-equity trade-off, which we haven't gotten our head around enough. But I would say that we definitely need to have an economic perspective on these issues as well, because from our point of view, global cooperation, whether in trade, finance, or tech, is a positive sum game. And we lose that if we apply a pure power prism to this analysis. Now, what I think is, because of the tectonic shift that we are seeing, we can no longer separate international economic policy from foreign policy. And I think that is something which you also very eloquently set out in this Global Asymmetry Strike Back essay. And that is something, and let me come to the challenge that means for the EU. Because this integrated policy making is perhaps more difficult for the EU than for other actors for several reasons. Well, one is one which is common to all political systems. Breaking down silos between policy communities is always difficult. Now, what is different in the EU is that we are doing this in a setup where we have some competences that are federalized, trade, currency, competition. We have others where the competences are shared between the member states and the EU level, and you have others, the security ones, which are now much more to the forefront, which are the realm of national governments. And linked to that is the third element that is different, and that is, in economics, we have managed to forge a common understanding of what our shared EU interests are. Not always without difficulties, but because it is federalized, because we are taking decisions with majority voting, etc., there was a strong pressure to form a joint understanding. That is missing in the foreign policy field. National vetoes mean that there is not enough of an incentive to come to put aside national differences and to come to a common understanding. So, as a consequence, in the EU, we have tended already for decades to use trade policy as a tool not just to regulate the flow of goods and services, but as a geo-economic tool, strategic partners, etc., opening up partnerships, etc. So the move towards geoeconomics has already happened at least since the early 2000s. If you look at the Global Europe communication, that is very much what inspired that policy line. Then it moved into further societal objectives, environmental, sustainability, etc., in the last decade. And now it's moving into the security. But of course, this is a challenge. And here again, an economic perspective is actually quite useful. So if I quote Mr. Tinbergen, you have a problem if you have one policy tool and you try to hit several policy objectives at the same time. So market access, and there is the attractiveness of the single market, which is our biggest asset. But I mean, you can only sell that so many times, and to use it to get so many returns on it. So this is something we really need to look at, and we face difficult trade-offs. And that is where the concept of open strategic autonomy comes in, which you can find in a lot of Commission and EU papers in the last months. and which has the merit of putting out in the open the trade-offs we face with that. Because it is a recognition that we have to navigate two concomitant but contradictory trends. One is we live in an interdependent world with mutual vulnerabilities, and I insist on the word mutual. And we depend on these interdependence and on the global value chains, etc., for our prosperity, in the EU, but also elsewhere. And the other trend is the increasing fragmentation of the governance and regulatory sphere. We need to manage these by bringing them together, and that is what we are trying to capture with open strategic autonomy. Openness as a strategic choice of the EU, but at the same time being aware that in doing that, we need to maintain our ability to chart our own course, to be autonomous. Not self-sufficient, but autonomous. I think here, trade policy is actually a big strength of the EU in this context. It gives us leverage, and it helps us influence the shape of the world around us. And we are trying to do that through a three-pronged approach. One is reforming the multilateral system, because I referred already to the difficulty that a power-based system represents. And I would argue it represents a difficulty also for the United States, because we have seen in the last 4 years that the US administration has tried to deal with China basically without rules through unilateral measures, to great cost to its own economy and great cost to its middle class. So from that point of view, I think there is a case to be made that an updated rules-based system with open plurilaterals as well, because not all the time all the WTO members will be able to move forward together, but a system that binds in China and deals with the distortions of the Chinese system. That is something that is also in the interest of the United States, and it is in the interest of China, because it protects against the abuse, the weaponization of trade, which, as I said, leads to maybe not even a zero-sum game, but actually a negative-sum game. Second angle of our policy, or prong of our policy, is building on the network of bilateral agreements that we have. We have the largest network, it serves us well. We need to develop it further, we need to update it. And that also in the context of the current crisis, where diversification of supply chains is even more important for the resilience of our economy. So we are also, however, using trade agreements more and more for other strategic objectives, as I said, as platforms for cooperation on issues like the Green Deal, and with our trade policy strategy of February this year, we have really put climate, the Green Deal, but also digitalization as the EU's growth strategy at the center of also of our trade policy. We are also putting more and more emphasis on core labor standards and human rights. But at the same time, we are also using our trade agreements more for regulatory cooperation. And we intend, there's a lot of talk about the Brussels effect, which is also the possibility to project further the impact of the single market. And we want to do that more with our neighborhood countries and with Africa in particular. But again, here we are facing a trade-off. So how much can we push trade agreements to serve non-trade objectives? What is the effectiveness of trade agreements to foster change in other areas like climate or human rights or labor rights protection? What is the negotiability? So we should not shy away from asking these hard questions, and we are currently analyzing that as we are looking into the implementation of our trade agreements. How can we do that better? But at the same time, and that is the last and perhaps the most innovative and most difficult strand of our policy, we need to take out an insurance policy against the abuse of our openness and against the weaponization by others of our openness. And that leads me to the autonomous instruments. Some are already in force, some have been proposed by the Commission, others are still under development inside the House, and they span across different internal and external policies. Hélène already referred to CBAM, which I would put in the category of promoting global public goods. It's an element which in itself, it's a small element of our overall climate policy, but it is an important one in order to incentivize global cooperation. We have forthcoming legislation on deforestation, on due diligence, on forced labor. Then we have another basket of autonomous measures on competitiveness. And here we are looking at the interaction between trade and industrial policy by working on strategic supply chains. But I would also emphasize that we need a pro-competitive regulation of the single market, in particular in the digital field, in order to be stronger in projecting this globally. Then we have the whole issue of level playing field. And here I'm talking about the way we use trade defense instruments, the international procurement instrument that hopefully will come out of the sausage-making machine, the law-making machine. We have the foreign subsidies instrument, which we have just proposed, so we will have to see how that works. And then the security box, the 5G toolbox, what I call strategic trade and investment control for security, i.e. FDI screening and export control. And then we are working on an anti-coercion instrument in order to be able to protect us against the weaponization that we have talked about. The challenge will be for us, can we develop these defensive instruments without falling into the trap of protectionism, which I think would hurt all of us. And I would say that the next 2 years will be decisive in terms of how we are setting ourselves up through domestic regulation, but also in the way in which we interact with the rest of the world through bilateral, multilateral, and plurilateral tracks. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you also for having started by reminding us, that globalization is too serious to be left to foreign policy types, and to having highlighted the difference in the sort of basic model, the basic mindset of the two communities. Before I go back, let me just give the result of a poll. No, the result has gone. So I'm sorry, I wanted to. It's not displayed anymore. Oh yeah, on the question that was asked, whether economic openness remains fundamentally beneficial and should be pursued multilaterally and bilaterally by the EU, or whether economic openness can be harmful, it should only be pursued by the EU on the condition that it does not result in technological, industrial, or resource dependency. We have 82% in favor of the first view, which, yeah, very visibly is close to your heart. I go back to the questions raised. Maria de Merz, the Deputy Director of Bruegel, asked, is there an inconsistency in Europe's pursuit of strategic autonomy and the need for greater global cooperation to deal with global public goods, climate, etc.? That's something we left a bit aside. So perhaps you may have reaction on this question. I would add, basically what you have tried to outline is sort of peaceful coexistence between economic integration and non-economic power relationship. So we have this sort of triangle. We have the mutually beneficial integration, the globalization of yesterday. We have the rivalry, and we have the global public goods. So how can this triangle, this trilemma be managed? That's the question I think that's in front of us. And you gave a sort of relatively optimistic view from the perspective of the EU on how it can be done. Adam gave a sort of more concerned view on whether the US, because of internal politics and because of the obsession with the power relationship with China, whether the US is able to manage this peaceful coexistence. So perhaps we can, on this question, see what the views of you three. Yeah.
Now, I think I would not. I'm intrigued by the fact that you characterize my intervention as optimistic. I would rather say it's determined. Because we cannot afford to, just say the world is in a terrible state and then hand-wring about it. I think we have an obligation to try and shape the world around us. And that is why I come back to the issue, to the concept of open strategic autonomy. Because, as I said, it lays open the trade-offs that is there. Mm-hmm. And it means that we will try everything, notably through engaging with the United States, with China, to update the global rule book. Because seriously, there's no alternative to it. China is there, we share the same planet. We need to work with China on a lot of common challenges, climate change being the most prominent. So we have to find a peaceful coexistence or a way to get along. But that also means that we have to explain to China that the distortions that its state capitalism brings are not acceptable to the rest of the world, and we will not take that lying down. And that we have ways to cooperate, including with the US, in order to counter certain practices, but that it is much better if they reform themselves, open up their economy, etc., accept disciplines, because that protects them against unilateralism. We need to create leverage in order to persuade China that this reform is in their interest. We also need to persuade the US, because they are not there yet. I agree with the analysis by Adam, that they are very skeptical about the ability of rules to discipline China. But they have made the experiment of trying it in another way, at great cost to themselves and without any outcome. If you look at the Phase 1 agreement, that is a mercantilistic, basically agricultural export deal. It does not tackle any of the structural issues that need to be tackled. We have the beginning of elements to tackle this in the trilateral cooperation, where we also have Japan. We have a group of like-minded countries in the WTO that are with us on that. Let's try and get China to a table and see whether we can move forward. At the same time, we are also working bilaterally with the US in order to compare notes on what we know about Chinese distortions, etc. And it will be interesting to see what we can achieve with the Trade and Tech Council that we have set up at the summit with the United States, and where we are just preparing the first session at the end of this month, and where we are looking at all these issues. And I think there we have to see what we can actually move forward with. And open strategic autonomy means that we will work with others wherever we can, and we will work autonomously wherever we must.
Thank you. Adam, perhaps starting with you, do you consider that the agenda that Sabine just defined is feasible from a US perspective? Especially two questions. One, could there be enough self-restraint on the part of the US to elicit the degree of confidence that would be required for China to consider that those disciplines are in its self-interest? Second, and I know you've worked on climate negotiation, to what degree can the global public good, especially climate and health, be sort of separated and preserved from the rivalry that may permeate other fields?
I find Sabina's presentation extraordinarily compelling. It induces in me, however, a sense of sort of cognitive dissonance, because it seems to come from a world of a rationality I understand, a series of commitments I understand, and I completely agree with her that it's very difficult to imagine anything other than rules. But just listen for a second to what Kurt Campbell, who is the senior American foreign policy decision maker on China, not decision maker, but advisor, and a man who's shaped American policy towards China since the pivot under Secretary of State Clinton in 2011. Listen what he said precisely on this issue of the possibility of peaceful coexistence, which, as Sabina said, we just have to accept. This is what he said in July in Stanford. Do I believe that China and the United States can coexist peacefully? Question mark. ... For drama. Yes, I do. But I do think this challenge is going to be enormously difficult for this generation and the next. So whereas Sabina posits a world in which we must coexist with China, and then the question is, how do we do this best? And clearly then rules are the easiest way to go. And as she demonstrates, we already have experience with various types of just strategic bargaining. In America, the question of whether we can coexist is open. I mean, the mood, to just use a shorthand, it's kind of Wagnerian. right? There is a sense that we might be in some sort of moment of showdown. So then that comes to your second question. I think climate, any optimistic expectations we had about grand bargains with the Biden administration on climate should be shelved. And this goes to another point that Samira was saying about the disaggregation of policymaking. It is entirely unclear, I think, whether or not the Biden administration is capable of coherently linking the international diplomacy of John Kerry, who shows up in Europe and elsewhere as a reliable, familiar American climate diplomat, and what the folks have to do who have to deliver climate policy on the ground in Congress, who are fighting a series of battles which are basically do not really have a counterpart in Europe. And so what is incredibly striking is the gap right now between precisely the kind of logic that Sabine is able to articulate. And I've never heard a more lucid demonstration of what open strategic autonomy is, which as you know is a subject of mirth amongst many Anglophone commentators. And there is the rationale, she's provided it. But there's a huge gap between that conversation and the substance, tone, and I think broader historical vision of policymaking in the US right now on this issue. For them, primacy is the fundamental issue.
Thank you. We're actually answering the number of questions on that. For example, question by Pauline Veil, is there a blurring of objective by the EU and the US between ensuring a level playing field with China and containing the rise of China? Which is precisely the point. Hélène, I'd like to elicit your comment on this discussion. Hélène?
Yeah. Yes. I think indeed the key challenge we have is how we're going to be able to deliver on key global public goods, and the most pressing one being climate change in this multilateral world where multilateralism has essentially died quite a bit, and we are now in much more relation of power mode. And there, I think the only way, though, to try at least is the one that is set out by Sabine, which is as far as we can have some tools in Europe that can induce people because of the size of our market, which is the only bargaining power that we have. And as I mentioned in my presentation, I mean, we have to use it and use it as quickly as we can, because in relative terms, we are shrinking. We have to use that bargaining power in the very specific form. So in the specific case of climate change with this border adjustment mechanism, in order to induce the other big blocks, which are responsible for a lot more of carbon emission than we are, to adjust their climate policy. And we just have to hope that, there are some initiatives in China. China has put in place an ETS market. It's still very, it's still very partial, and the price of carbon is still very low, etc. But mechanisms are being put in place, and what we can hope we do is by making these incentives, we are kind of pushing forward mechanisms which are already existing in other areas, and trying to converge as fast as we can. This is, I think, the only card that we can rationally play to make things move forward.
Thank you. I don't know how much time we still have. Do we have to wrap up? It seems we do. Yes? Okay. If we do have to wrap up, let me certainly thank all three speakers. I mean, the topic was very broad. We didn't explore its various dimensions. There's one dimension we did not really explore perhaps sufficiently, and I would like to leave you with the question. There's the world as it is, and there is the world as it should be. And so implicitly we're defining a sort of a strange world that's multilateral and multipolar at the same time, that deals with global public goods and accepts that there are rivalry dimensions at the same time. And the question really is how this world could work. And I think multipolarity has always been used as a sort of, simple or seemingly simple concept, but what it is really, because of the reality, is one of the emergence of a series of significant poles with different preferences. and a shifting balance of economic weight, not to speak of power. I think to understand really how this could work and how some of the function, like the Kindleberger function that Hélène emphasized, who is in the end the importer of last resort, the player of last resort, the provider of liquidity of last resort in such a world. I think those are very difficult questions for economists, and perhaps something we should be giving more thought, even though we're very far from the normative discussion. We're more into the realistic discussion for the time being. So let me thank all three speakers. Let me thank all those who asked questions. I wasn't able to convey all the questions. Welcome to the next session, which is coming soon.